kamikaze bombings on the fleet, including attacks on this very ship. Heiman's outfit took over Chinmu Field, an airstrip vital to sustaining the bombing of Japan. He later served on occupation duty in Japan, flying as a radio operator on staff of the commander of the 5th Fleet, taking intelligence personnel to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and other sites in the Pacific, and even surviving an airplane crash on Iwo Jima. Sergeant Heiman was honorably discharged on December 10, 1947. Today, Dr. Heiman is Chancellor of the University of Richmond and serves as the national spokesman for the Greatest Generations Foundation, a Denver-based nonprofit organization which, as Ruthann mentioned, is sponsoring the return of 20 World War II veterans to Pearl Harbor this week. Please welcome Dr. E. Bruce Heiman.
President Carr, Madam Becker, Admiral Garnier, Captain James, fellow veterans, and all the distinguished folks already mentioned and not mentioned who are in the audience this morning. We're engaged in an important commemorative ceremony. Our presence here calls to mind an even more significant occasion in the life of this battleship. What transpired on this deck 66 years ago represents to hundreds of thousands who served in World War II an extension of their lives even to this day. Nothing said or done on this deck will rise to the momentous impact of the signing of the final surrender of the Japanese Empire to the United States under the auspices of General Douglas MacArthur. I was among the commemorating force at the 50th anniversary of the ending of the war at the Punch Bowl. Among others attending were the senior officers of the military who prosecuted that particular war and who won it. Also from the political arena were the top people who were engaged, the World War II Medal of Honor winners, Bob Hope, and a host of those who entertained World War II veterans along with President Clinton. In the 16 years since, almost all of the senior officers, the Medal of Honor winners, those who entertained, and the senior officers have deceased. They're not here with us today. Thus today we have mainly the enlisted and junior level officers to tell the story of how we won World War II. There are no generals or admirals to represent the 16 million who served and the fewer than 2 million who survived, but who are dying at the rate of 30,000 a month. 10 years from now, most of those remaining, including those on the front row, will have passed on, so that few, if any, will be present for the ceremony on the 76th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War. Those of us here will be from age 95 to 101. Therefore, the importance of remembering now the sacrifices and acts of heroism representative of their service cannot be overstated. As their spokesperson, I do not presume to characterize the best nor the least of the significance of what they did. Thus I share my reflections and experiences as one of the many who willingly committed to endure whatever hardships or injuries or risks were required. In that spirit, my comments are intended to be more generic than personal. Last year, 11 Marines with as many college students under the auspices of the Greatest Generation Foundation and the College of the Ozarks returned to battlefields they never expected to see again. Upon landing on Iwo Jima, one of the group bowed silently to the ground. When he arose, there were tears streaming from his eyes. "I just don't know how he did it," he said. "I don't either," another replied. As they climbed Mount Suribachi, they remembered the sacrifice of some 7,000 Marines dead with 20,000 wounded. "The experience is past," said one, "but the memories are forever embedded in my mind. I'll never forget this mountain." The landscape of Iwo Jima could not have been forgotten. The black sand was still there to remind them of the reality of the experience and of their good fortune of having lived through it all. I became a survivor of Iwo Jima following combat on Okinawa. As an air crewman flying throughout the Pacific during the occupation of Japan, I landed there periodically. On one such occasion, our plane was buffeted so heavily by crosswinds that the plane rolled over literally and crashed into its left wing. We abruptly hit the ground, endured a few seconds of sheer terror, hearing the sound of crushing metal and whirling propellers digging into the earth. We exited because a miracle of miracles occurred and no fireball erupted through whatever holes we could find, expressing either audibly or silently, "Thank the Lord we survived." From Iwo Jima, we traveled to Okinawa, where Americans died by the thousands to take down the Japanese flag, and the Japanese died by the thousands to prevent the raising of the American flag. Now we observe the American and Japanese flags flying together. Such contradictions, no matter how confusing and how disconcerting, result from the continuous shifting of the sands of time. We drove near the city of Naha to the beaches where we had dug in and slept the first night after landing. Today, that beach is overlaid with buildings, roadways, airport facilities, massive traffic, and swarms of people. It's almost overpowering in contrast with the destruction I remembered. What was important in the past, even if earth-shaking then and seemingly worth dying for, is of little consequence in the minds of those who live there today. In the 82 days of battle on Okinawa, an average of 2,500 people died every day. The Okinawans were begged to come out of their caves, but fearful their women would be raped and tortured, they refused and were thus treated as combatants, destroyed by flamethrowers, dynamite, and bulldozers. Like tens of thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, certainly including those before me this morning, I had joined the Marines at age 17, and a troop ship became a part of my future. A few months later, at age 18, I was joining a host of other Marines bound for points unknown in the bowels of one of those ships. Following the initial seasickness and coming to grips with the reality of it all, we progressed beyond Hawaii and into the deep Pacific, where potentialities of serious consequence lay ahead. When a Japanese submarine was observed tracking our convoy, action was initiated to reduce to a minimum the risk of losing a ship and hundreds of Marines. The greatest concern was of being torpedoed on a dark night while deep in the hold of the ship. Getting out would be the first priority. Surviving in oily and burning water was the next challenge. A high school classmate of mine was on the USS Indianapolis when she went down with casualties of 1,200 out of 1,500. He and most others failed to survive the sharks. The news being picked up by the convoy and passed along in daily bulletins was neither positive for the Marines nor the sailors aboard the ship. More and more Japanese suicide squadrons were rendering disastrous damage to our ships off the island of Okinawa. If that was to be our destination, then we speculated that we might not survive long enough to bolster the forces already there. But land we did, and along with joining the battle, we became a part of the forward force for the coming invasion of the Japanese homeland. That battle, projected to take place on November the 15th, 1945, was to be a do-or-die situation, with the latter appearing to be the most probable result. We were in agreement that our chances of survival were small. Thus, the act of using the bombs was assurance that the lives we have lived in the meantime were gifts of present truth. I walked in the ashes of radioactive dirt, dust, and destruction of Nagasaki and Hiroshima shortly after the bombs were dropped, and I viewed the skeletons of the few remaining structures. Now, 65 and a half years later, I had returned to see that city a thriving metropolis. When asked to share my thoughts concerning the bombing of the city, I acknowledge that it was a wonderful revelation to see the rebirth and renewal which, like the Sphinx, had risen from the ashes, and that out of the dictatorial government had come freedom and democracy. We whose lives were spared could never apologize for having the bombs dropped. Doing so would be expressing regrets for having married our wives, fathered our children, and grandfathered our grandchildren. Without the bomb, we would have died in the battle for the Japanese mainland by suicide planes diving into our troop ships, by machine guns as we stormed the beaches, or by poison spears that the women and children would have forced into us. Today, some protest the act of our having used the atomic bombs, yet most have little knowledge of the realities of that time. Without those bombs, my mother would have lost one or two, or perhaps all three of her sons who served in the armed forces. The kill or be killed tenacity of the Japanese likely could not have been overcome without the climatic impact of two atomic bombs, both on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We veterans here today have been fortunate to live long lives, even though with millions of other young men of that era, all of us accepted death as a real possibility. Thus, the prevailing provincial consequences gave all of us a unique perspective for the rest of our lives. Whether returning to the battlefields of our youth or reflecting upon our service for whatever it might have been, this celebration is a part of bringing closure from whatever shadows remain in the crevices of our minds. Because of the ultimate pride in having served, we never seek total closure. Thus, to end this commentary of renewal and remembrance, I cite some selected lines from Tennyson's Ulysses, representative of the aging of all the airmen, soldiers, sailors, and Marines who served in World War II. Old age has yet his honor and his toil. Some work of noble work may yet be done. Come, my friends, it's not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset in the vast of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the Gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides, and though that strength which in past years moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. And while sacrifice and heroism may appropriately call to mind periods of suffering and distress, for most veterans, the pride of having served and the return on their investment in preserving freedom for themselves and their fellow man overrides the darkness of the experience and embraces the words of Edward Markham, "There's a destiny that makes us brothers. None goes his way alone. All that we send into the lives of others comes back into our own." And finally, to the Battleship Museum Foundation and the Missouri ship, we express our deep gratitude for being allowed to have a part in this commemorative celebration and to sit before you on this ship in respect to you and in pride of our own service. Thank you.